come to talk to you about addiction, the power of addiction, but also addiction to power. As a medical doctor, I work in Vancouver, Canada, and I've worked with some very, very addicted people. People who use heroin, they inject cocaine, they drink alcohol, crystal meth, and every drug known to man. And these people suffer. If the success of a doctor is to be measured by how long his patients live, then I'm a failure, because my patients die very young, relatively speaking. They die of HIV, they die of hepatitis C, they die of infections of their heart valves, they die of infections of their brains, of their spine, of their hearts, of their bloodstream. They die of suicide, of overdose, of violence, of accidental deaths. And if you look at them, you call to mind the words of the great Egyptian novelist Naguib Mahfouz, who wrote, "Nothing records the effects of a sad life as graphically as the human body," because these people lose everything. They lose their health, they lose their beauty, they lose their teeth, they lose their wealth, they lose human relationship, and in the end, they often lose their lives. And yet nothing shakes them from their addiction. Nothing can force them to give up their addiction. The addictions are powerful, and the question is why?
Today I would like to break down the largest raider group in Fallout New Vegas, the Fiends. Fiends is a term notoriously short for chem fiends, chem being a softball replacement term the Fallout universe often uses in place of drugs. The Fiends are a group of drug-addicted individuals who use violence and organized attacks to maintain their way of life and drug use. They purchase their drugs from suppliers such as the Great Khans, which we'll get into later, but they come by their means by way of theft and assault. The remains of post-war Las Vegas have been home to many raider gangs, such as the three families who ran the strip before Mr. House whipped them into shape. We also have the previously mentioned Great Khans, Jackals, Vipers, and now the Powder Gangers. However, there is another group that is not only more dangerous than those mentioned, but perhaps more dangerous than all of them combined. That is, of course, the Fiends of Southwest Vegas, the only raider gang to not only border the mighty walls of New Vegas, but border the walls of the New California Republic's main base of operations in the region at Camp McCarran. While that might seem absurd to think at first that one raider gang in the region might be greater than the sum of the rest, but perhaps this will become less egregious of a thought upon further inspection. The Great Khans, for example, are shells of their former selves. They get pushed around from reservation to reservation by the NCR, becoming a parallel to the United States' treatment of the Native Americans. The recent Bitter Springs massacre marks a distinct change in the Great Khans' role as a faction in Fallout. They are now tucked away in Red Rock Canyon, far from major settlements, difficult to raid or attack anyone from. Their current living space indicates their current motives. They're hiding, they're in recovery mode. No settlements in the wastes are afraid of their presence. While the Powder Gangers clearly pose a threat due to their somewhat decent organization and use of explosives, they are also not as well organized as the other gangs of the Mojave. The Powder Gangers are split into roughly 5 different subgroups. Eddie leads the group of Powder Gangers held up at the NCR Correctional Facility, while Chavez leads a small splinter group made up of those who didn't want to pay a tax Eddie implemented. Eddie has already effectively turned his people on himself through greed and lack of sufficient power over the whole of the faction. Joe Cobb leads a group from that same base that hopes to take over Good Springs and establish a presence there, while Samuel Cook and Philip Lem are the 2 leaders of a large group of Powder Gangers that migrated to Vault 19, not too far from Great Khan territory. This group in Vault 19 is split into 2 opposing sides between Philip Lem and Samuel Cook. Their story is for another day, but the point is, while the Powder Gangers are large and dangerous, they are divided and more easily taken apart as a result. The Vault 19 group can even be convinced to fold into the ranks of the Great Khans. While their capturing of a vault is a major benefit, their fickleness as a group and their lack of direction or commitment cancels this out. The Vipers and Jackals are minor roadside thugs. They rely on sabotage, sneak attacks, and traps due to their small numbers and limited arsenal. This is furthered by their placement in the game world. They live on the outskirts of relevant locations, generally far from the Strip and wealthier parts of the Mojave. They find themselves far out in the desert, avoiding the law as best as possible. In comparison to the rest of the factions I just mentioned, the Fiends, unlike the Great Khans hiding in a canyon, live directly within the most populated, resource-dense, wealthiest portion of the region, with more factions and groups densely packed right next to them, yet they carve out an enormous territory, larger than even the Brotherhood of Steel maintains. Oh, and by the way, they are next-door neighbors with the NCR, who potentially have the largest military left on Earth as far as we can tell. Much like the Powder Gangers, the Fiends maintain a vault, which we will discuss later. However, there are no splinter groups in the Fiends from what we can tell. There are multiple leaders, but they all answer to Motor Runner. They act as his generals in a way and bolster his control over the group of drug-crazed murderers. And unlike the Vipers and the Jackals, the Fiends have weapons, many of which sport energy weapons that outclass even the NCR soldiers' rifles they come into contact with. The Fiends also don't struggle with small numbers like the Vipers and Jackals. Turns out that addiction still runs rampant in Vegas, there's no shortage on willing recruits, and I doubt birth control is a Fiend priority. I know this might seem like an odd angle to consider, but drug use and sex can often go hand in hand, so the Fiends have no shortage of people within their group. Now I want to break down a little bit about the drugs of Fallout before we discuss the leaders so we can learn a bit more about what kind of state they might be in. As stated before, drugs in Fallout are often referred to as chems. Like most things in Fallout, chems generally have some real-world equivalent we can look to understand what kind of effects these chems might have on people. Now, there's not a whole lot of specifically laid out one-to-one comparisons, especially because the drug effects can change throughout the series, like Jet, for instance. You also have chems like Buffout representing some sort of steroid equivalent, while Psycho is said to be a military-created cocktail to enhance soldiers. This is potentially in reference to soldiers in certain wars being given drugs like cocaine to enhance their abilities. Med-X was originally even called morphine before Bethesda changed it to make Fallout 3 legal in Australia. It has perhaps become heroin to some extent as well due to its street use. Regardless, it is an incredibly addictive and destructive pain reliever in the opioid family. Opioid use disorder is classified as a chronic recurrent disease of the central nervous system, which leads to personality disorders, comorbidities, and premature death. It develops as a result of long-term administration of various abused substances along with morphine. This is via the National Library of Medicine. Point being, the chems the Fiends are using have destructive effects on their mind. They chemically alter their users, and prolonged use only furthers these alterations. Now to put an end to the comparisons and return to directly discussing the Fiends. As I stated before, the Fiends have multiple leaders. There are 4 in total, with the 3 sub-leaders and Violet, Cook, and Driver Nephi, finally leaving us with the King Fiend, Motor Runner. Upon speaking to Violet, you'll find her nearly incomprehensible and frantic. She stutters and twitches as she speaks, and when combined with aggressive outbursts, this gives off the impression that she is incredibly unhinged. She is obsessed with her dogs and also expresses paranoia about them and their meat. She lives in a trailer temple surrounded by her pack, along with her personal pet aptly named Violetta. Her voice is shaky and her eyes are dull and glazed over. She is also covered in grime with a pair of human hands hooked to her waist. She seems like she is in a worse state than the other leaders, more strung out. Nonetheless, she is clearly the Fiend's Beastmaster. Cook seems slightly more with it, and then again slightly more without it. He's a cook and kindly offers to make you dinner sometime. It's hard to tell if he means prepare you a meal or make you the meal. He also has a pet just like Violet, but his is a Brahmin named Queenie. Cook seems like he enjoys drug use, but he doesn't seem as strung out as the others. He wears bulky armor and has a big flamer strapped to his back. He also is potentially the bruiser of the leaders.
Name's Nephi, friend. Driver Nephi. Pleasure to meet you. Now you fucking dolt. Why the hell would it be a pleasure?
Driver Nephi, without a doubt, seems the most likely to just kill you as you speak to him. He's sarcastic and really likes his 9-iron because he enjoys killing people with it. He also seems absolutely devoid of compassion or life, numb to any emotions. While Violet seemed like an unhinged addict foaming at the mouth like one of her rabid pups, and Cook seems like a big bruiser with less brains and more muscle, Nephi is clearly of a different ilk. He appears to be more capable than the others and almost enjoys the NCR's presence as it gives him more people to taunt. He is able to effectively engage armed NCR soldiers, batter them with a 9-iron, and potentially has racked up more kills with a golf club than the rest of the leaders combined. He appears as a completely cold sociopath, enjoying the playground the Vegas wasteland has become for him. Finally, we get to the king of the Fiends, Motor Runner, who appears eerily similar to Driver Neffy, yet despite not having the kill count on NCR soldiers of him,
I guess it isn't a secret. Yeah, the residents of the vault are all dead. We killed them. Funny thing is, they just let us in. We didn't have to force the doors or anything.
Motor Runner has the mind, means, and ability to run the group of Raider addicts. The Fiends might appear as a group with no allies, merely New Vegas' version of Raiders given a bit of flair and background. However, they find relevance in the larger game world. The Great Khans are a major drug runner, and the Fiends are huge buyers from them. Motor Runner knows his people need a steady supply. They can't just rip up the wasteland forever. The Fiends live near Red Rock Canyon, home of the Khans, and there's no one between them. The Fiends raid caravans, attack the NCR soldiers or citizens, and get the caps they need to buy their chems from the Great Khans. Motor Runner maintains the Fiends as a somewhat stable and growing group and holds domain over a large urban swath of southwest Vegas. The Great Khans feed into a group that is actively attacking their greatest enemies in the NCR, while a massive army of Fiend raiders festers in South Vegas, providing an enormous barrier between them and the NCR. The relationship Motor Runner has been able to cultivate with the Great Khans benefits them both, protecting the Khans and making the Fiends grow rapidly. I just think the point needs to be stressed. Motor Runner is creating a serious problem for one of the Wasteland's largest armies. Not only that, but Mr. House, every family in Vegas, the NCR, and West Side would all love to see the Fiends gone. These are some of the most powerful players in the region. They are actively harassed by the Fiends, yet they can do nothing about them as things stand. Part of this has to do with the invasion Motor Runner led on Vault 3. Oddly enough, Vault 3 was a control vault, only one of 17. So despite so many vaults being home to horrific experiments on their dwellers, Vault 3 happened to be one designed to do as one might hope. For a long time, it kept the dwellers alive and safe from the nuclear holocaust. That was until a water leak occurred due to an ordinary malfunction. This forced them to eventually open up to trade with the Las Vegas region. For a couple of weeks, things seemed alright. Little did they know the war zone they had just poked their heads out into. The wasteland had turned the surrounding people into a brutal and unforgiving form. The 3 casino families on the Strip were not too dissimilar from the Fiends until Mr. House got a hold of them. And what does that tell you about the Fiends? That Mr. House was able to break the gangs that were on the Strip, make them work for him, while the Fiends still piss in his backyard and damage his tourism on the daily. Unfortunately for the residents of Vault 3, they found the results to a different experiment. They found out what happens if you grow soft in your safety. With their minds not attuned to what the world outside had become and their inability to defend themselves, the Fiends walked in and led them like lambs to slaughter. They stood no chance. In this loss, the Fiends gained Vault 3, a stronghold that would help them become what they are today. This leads us to the ongoing NCR Fiend War. This conflict began when the president at the time, Wendell Peterson, brought the NCR military to the Vegas area. With much of their lands in New California settled and minimal Raider presence remaining, the Fiends are an outlier for them. The Fiends are noted to use guerrilla tactics against the NCR but are significantly more dangerous than most Raider groups. Perhaps this is due to their well-stocked supply, especially with chems like Psycho and Med-X. There are many outcomes within the Fiends' future. They are of course a group of unstable individuals, and who knows what will happen in the absence of Motor Runner. His death or loss of power could lead the Fiends to turning on the Great Khans and destroying them. If that happens, they will lose their steady drug supply and be forced out into the wastes to feed their insatiable desires. Added pressure on the NCR during the time of war with the Legion could force the NCR to capitulate and leave the region. This could also significantly damage the New Vegas Strip and House's plans altogether. However, if the NCR falls and the Legion takes its place, it will not matter if Motor Runner remains in charge. It will not matter if Violet assembles all of her dogs, if Cook feeds the Fiends the best meal they've had the night before, nor if Driver Neffy perfects his swing to the T, no pun intended. The Fiends will be exterminated quickly by Caesar and his Legion. This much we know. His faction has no tolerance for drug use. They do not even allow the use of modern medicine in most cases. They are ideologically opposed to the Fiends and more than capable of dealing with them. Caesar specializes in bringing large tribal forces to their knees and has an army of legionnaires who know all too well what the Fiends would have in store for them. Caesar would not absorb them like another tribe into his army. He finds their dependency on chems to be too great of a detriment. The Fiends are a fascinating Raider faction, and I really wish some of the cut content around them made it into the game. You are not able to speak with the leaders and access their dialogue without the help of mods. Their dialogue, however, is there and a part of the actual game. Ideally, the Fiends could delve deeper into the topics of drug addiction and substance abuse. What we become addicted to can have such a profound effect on our lives, and it is all too easy to assume our addictions are not as bad as some others. This helps us develop a blind spot, further ignoring our issues because it's quote-unquote not as bad. What better setting in a Fallout series to discuss addiction than in Sin City, the land of addictions? An article from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration contains a report on Vegas and Nevada drug use from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. Not only does Vegas have a higher percentage of substance abuse disorders than the United States average, the state of Nevada was higher than even that. We can see the relevance addiction has to the real-world location. I'll end once more with a deep and thoughtful quote from an aspiring young fiend poet. Heh heh. Good meat, huh? Cat meat? Rat meat? Dog meat? Maybe even you meat.
There's another little experiment with mice where infant mice, if they're separated from the mothers, will not cry for their mothers. Now, what would that mean in the wild? It means that they would die, because only the mother protects the child's life and nurtures the child. And why? Because genetically, they knocked out the receptors, the chemical binding sites in the brain for endorphins. And endorphins are our indigenous morphine-like substances. Endorphins are our own natural painkillers. What endorphins also do, they make possible the experience of love. They make possible the experience of attachment to the parent and the parent's attachment to the child. So these little mice without endorphin receptors in their brains will actually not call for their mothers. In other words, the addiction to these drugs, and of course the heroin and the morphine, what they do is they act on the endorphin system. That's why they work. And so the question is, what happens to people that they need these chemicals from the outside? Well, what happens to them is when they're abused as children, those circuits don't develop. When you don't have love and connection in your life, when you're very, very young, then those important brain circuits just don't develop properly. And under conditions of abuse, things just don't develop properly, and their brains then are susceptible when they do the drugs. Now they feel normal, now they feel pain relief, now they feel love. And there's one patient said to me that when I first did heroin, she said, it felt like a warm, soft hug, just like a mother hugging a baby.